the lawyers at Connecting Ottawa. On behalf of Connecting Ottawa's team, myself, Gina Grosnick, and Liz Mayik, I'd like to welcome you to our annual conference. Connecting Ottawa's conference this year is a hot topic. And so the three of us will be sharing the hosting duties this afternoon for our conference. So, first off, we would like to start this meeting by acknowledging the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. Uh, this is where we're learning, this is where we're working, this is where we're sharing today. And so, in our work, we really believe that it's important to recognize that as we discuss and explore access to justice issues today, for those who are newcomers or those who come from the community uh, that face communication barriers, we also want to mention those who have been denied their rights systematically. And so, for our own nation's first people, we wanted to recognize that as we are settlers on this land, we deeply appreciate the historic connection of the Algonquin Anishinaabe tribe and other indigenous peoples. Today's event would not have been possible without our funder, the Law Foundation of Ontario. Those that don't know, Connecting Ottawa is funded by the Law Foundation of Ontario. We want to thank the Law Foundation for their continued support of our project. We want to express our deep appreciation to CLEO, the Community Legal Education Ontario. They're sharing their technical resources today. They're sharing their expertise. So everything is flowing beautifully. And that's not Connecting Ottawa, that really is CLEO. So we really appreciate your generosity and your help on that. So a few housekeeping items for today. Before we start, you'll note that on the platform, there is a chat function. There's the Q&A. And so please do use the Q&A feature. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, including difficulty seeing the ASL translators, please send us a note in the chat box, and we will address it. For the Q&A feature, we strongly encourage you to post any questions that you might have for the speakers in the Q&A as opposed to the chat. Following the speaker's formal presentation, we will pull any questions from the Q&A box for feedback. You won't have the opportunity to ask questions live, directly live, but you will have the opportunity to ask questions in the Q&A. And so if you have an inquiry, please post it there. Also, please be aware that if you are bumped out of the session or you leave voluntarily for any reason, please just re-enter through the same link that you used to join. So for any reason that you don't that you're unable to remain in the chat or in the session, you can just sign back in with the link that was provided to you. We also want to be clear that this webinar is for general information purposes only. This webinar is not at all legal advice and should not be considered to be legal advice. We're giving legal information, and the answers that we're providing are being provided by our legal experts or written in the Q&A. They're not intended to be used as legal advice or specific legal advice to a specific legal problem. Rather, it's just intended to be used as legal information. Finally, I'd like to direct your attention to our resource sheet. You should see it up on the screen there. We've developed this resource sheet and it's related to all the topics that will be covered today. So you'll see various topics there, and you'll be able to redirect yourself using the resource sheet. And also you'll be able to access these resources on our website. So I'd like to pass it along to Gina for the rest.
Thanks, Alex. I'm just going to pause here for a minute. We're receiving some notifications in the chat that individuals are having problems with the view or with the audio. Michelle from Clio is responding to you right now. If you're continuing with these problems, please send a note to either the general chat or to Michelle at Clio Webinar, and we'll try and get you sorted out. Okay, thank you very much. So So we'll continue on now. Good afternoon. As mentioned, I'm Gina Grosnick. I'm the project manager of Connecting Ottawa. And we're thrilled now to move on to the formal part of our program. So our topic today is COVID-19 vaccines, status and supporting vulnerable populations. So alongside the amazing news of COVID-19 vaccines being made available came some concerns related to the safety, efficacy, and legal implications of these vaccines, both on vulnerable populations and on the general citizenship at large. And so as more and more of these issues surfaced, and the need for information grew, we chose this topic for this year's conference to help our partners and other community and legal workers to better inform their clients. So our goals today are up on the screen. What we want to try and do today is understand the status of the vaccines and some of the myths around vaccines that are potentially leading to hesitancy, understand some of the legal issues related to immigration and travel and vaccines, understand some of the legal issues related to employment, which are coming out more and more, and offer some resources for frontline workers to draw on when providing information on these issues to their clients. So we'll now move to our first speakers. I'm very excited to introduce this panel. When developing the agenda, we felt we really had to start with where are we in Ontario with vaccines and what are some of the myths circulating around these vaccines. So our two speakers are experts in this area. Dr. Meb Rashid is the medical director of the Crossroads Clinic, a medical clinic that serves refugees arriving in Toronto. He also co-founded the Canadian Doctors for Refugee Care and the Christie Refugee Health Clinic, a health clinic located in a refugee shelter. He's on staff at the Women's College Hospital in Toronto and is an assistant professor with the Department of Family and Community Medicine at the University of Toronto. Dr. Isaac Bogosh is an associate professor at the University of Toronto in the Department of Medicine and is an infectious disease specialist and general internist at the Toronto General Hospital with a focus on tropical diseases, HIV, and general infectious diseases, and has become one of the fonts of knowledge for everybody during this COVID crisis. So I'd like to welcome both, and I will ask them to unmute themselves and we'll move forward with the presentation.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Gina. I think what we're going to do is I'll start by going through just a bit of a background with some slides, and then hopefully we'll have ample time for Isaac to handle any questions that people might have. So I don't know if you can put the slides up. Perfect. So what I really wanted to do today was to speak about the things I'd want to know if I was going to get the vaccine. So one, how effective are they? What are their side effects? And how do I actually go about getting one? So next slide. So let's start with that first question. How effective are these COVID vaccines? And I apologize in advance because I'm going to run you through some numbers. Next slide, please. So let's start with the first two vaccines that were licensed in Canada. These were the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine that was licensed, I think it was December 9th, but sometime in early December, and then Moderna that followed a couple of weeks later. The trials that led to their licensing in Canada, I've detailed here. So as you can see, the Pfizer trial, which is the one on the left, a massive trial, 40,000 people, Moderna, over 30,000 participants. And just to contextualize this, many vaccines will come to market based on trials that have 6,000 to 8,000 people. So these are really, really robust trials. Pfizer looked at people over 16 years of age, Moderna over 18, and both of them are two-shot vaccines, right? So in the trials, Pfizer used two shots in an interval of 21 days. Moderna, the interval was 28 days. And as many of you know, both these vaccines now are being rolled out with much larger intervals here in Ontario, and that's something that we'll talk about. Next slide. So how effective were they? Well, quite astonishingly, when we looked at their ability to prevent illness, they both came in around 95% after a week or two after that second shot. Now, this is about as good as you're ever going to get with the vaccine, right? 95%. And what was also very useful to know is that effectiveness, that efficacy was the same across age, gender, race, and ethnicity. So it worked in all those subcategories just as well, 95% effective. Next slide. The next couple of vaccines that came out were the AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson vaccines. So these have really been approved in Canada the last couple of months. Johnson & Johnson hasn't landed yet. We don't have any Johnson & Johnson in the country yet, but it has been licensed and we're awaiting its arrival. Now with Johnson & Johnson, there's actually two large published trials. The first one was actually a fusion of two trials, one from the UK and one from Brazil. The one I'm quoting here was a trial that was predominantly took place in the United States that was licensed, that was published a few weeks ago. And I think, to me, a much better trial, more compelling, not as muddled, perhaps, as the first one. And again, very impressive numbers. So 32,000 with the Johnson & Johnson trial, 32,000 with the AstraZeneca trial, 43,000 with the Johnson & Johnson trial. Like Moderna, they studied people over 18. And if you're wondering why we cannot give these vaccines to kids, it's just that the original studies took place generally in adults, all over 18, except for Pfizer, which is over 16. The AstraZeneca trial had people between 4 and 12 weeks. And they were predominantly with a 4-week gap in the US study. In the original study, it was more varied. And what makes Johnson & Johnson more quite compelling is it's a single shot, right? And you can imagine the logistics around that are so much easier. Next slide, please. So how effective were they? Well, AstraZeneca came in at 76% after the second dose. Johnson & Johnson, I'm sorry, I've lost these in the headings. On the right is a Johnson & Johnson. It really varied. So in the US arm of that trial, it was 72%. A little bit less in Latin America, and interesting in South Africa, it was about 64%. Now, we look at these numbers and we think, wow, impressive, right? We would all been very happy with this in November, December of last year. But it's really easy to look at Pfizer and Moderna and say, look, 95% seems like a much bigger number than the 60, 70% that I've got up here on this slide. But remember, these studies were done at very different times, right? So the Pfizer and Moderna studies took place in the summer of 2020, where we really didn't have the variants of concern that we have now. AstraZeneca, that trial went right up into February. The Johnson & Johnson trial also went into 2021. So it had a much higher rate of variants. And we know some of those variants don't do as well with vaccines. The vaccines have all been shown to be pretty good with some of them, and we'll talk about that in a little bit of detail. The other thing that I want to draw your attention to is this data from South Africa. So remember, one of the variants, the 135 variant actually came out of South Africa. Johnson & Johnson was able to show that it does have an impact on that variant, right? So it's one of the advantages of that Johnson & Johnson study, that it did come late and it did include a fair number of people from South Africa. Next slide, please. Okay, now the thing that I think is most compelling is when we look at rates of hospitalization and even serious illness in all of these studies. And what's interesting is that all of them are pretty much at 100%. Moderna, there was one person who might have had the vaccine who kind of tested positive. So we put that in just to be conservative. But really, these vaccines are all highly effective in preventing you from being hospitalized, ending up in the ICU, and getting very, very ill. And I think that's really important to recognize. Now, all these studies we're talking about took place, different countries, different times. What about how effective they've been really in terms of real world data? Next slide, please. I think for me, one of the most compelling pieces of information is really what's happened here in long-term care. So remember, long-term care really ground zero. 60 to 70% of the deaths that we saw in Ontario were in long-term care in that first and second wave. This is a graph looking at long-term care cases over time. And you can see sort of in that peak of that second wave that we hit 1,650 residents in long-term care that actually were COVID positive, right? Now that's only 3 months ago. Next slide, please. Take a look at these numbers from March. So 1,650, look at the active resident case, the middle column. That went from 1,650 down to single digits, right? And this is, of course, at a time when we've seen numbers growing exponentially in the province. These vaccines do work. Remember, long-term care was one of the places it was really focused on in phase 1 of the rollout. Mobile teams went in, they vaccinated, everyone got 2 doses. and look at the results we're seeing. It works. What about in other countries? Next slide, please. So really the leaders in the world in terms of vaccination have been Israel and the United Kingdom. And when we look at cases in Israel, you can see while numbers are going up all across the world, they've plummeted in Israel in the last few weeks. Next slide. And the same can be said in the UK, right? So again, you see this huge dip. Now, this isn't all vaccine, right? You know, there have been lockdowns. There's certainly those other issues that we've talked about that we're all aware of, social distancing, masking. But this is really impressive, right? The vaccines do seem to work. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are we still learning? So I mentioned the variants briefly. I think it's safe to say at this point, and I look forward to Isaac's comments on this. You know, all the vaccines seem to work very well on that B117 variant, the variant that came out of the UK, right? And the one that really is circulating in high numbers here in Ontario. We have less data on the one that came out of South Africa, the 135. I mentioned the Johnson & Johnson trial. You will hear people refer to a study that AstraZeneca did. It was part of their larger study, relatively small numbers, a very young population. They found the results weren't great in terms of mild to moderate cases. They didn't see a lot of severe cases in that study, which is somewhat reassuring, although it was a very young population. But we just don't have as much data on the 135 or the P1 that came out of Brazil. The other question is, how long do the vaccines work? Will we all need a booster? Remember that we really started using these vaccines 5 months ago, so we're not sure. I think a lot of experts feel this very well may be on the horizon. Already, Pfizer, Moderna, and I'm sure all the other companies are looking at altering their vaccines to ensure that there is good coverage for some of these variants of concern. And then the other question we have there, do the vaccines prevent spread of COVID-19? I think we're starting to get more robust information. I think most people clearly state, yeah, absolutely. So not only do they prevent illness, not only do they prevent severe illness, but I think the data is accumulating that they're pretty good at preventing us from carrying it and spreading it to people without illness. So highly, highly effective. Next slide. Okay, so what about the side effects? You know, if we've decided that they work, what are the risks when we take it in terms of having a reaction to it? Next slide, please. So the good news is that the side effects really are pretty much similar to what you're going to get with any vaccine, such as the flu shot. So things like you can get a low-grade fever, you can get fatigue, you can get headaches. And when we look at the data, you can see that really the most common thing is pain at the injection site. Your arm hurts for a couple of days, right? You know, you can also see things like, you know, feeling tired, having a headache, that sensation like you're about to get ill. You know, less commonly, you can get redness and swelling at the injection site, nausea or vomiting, and then even less commonly enlarged lymph nodes. Serious allergic reactions are very rare. With the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine, they're probably somewhere in the 1 in 200 to 300,000 range, according to data that came out of the US quite early. Remember, no one is going to get this vaccine anywhere where there isn't someone who can deal with severe allergic reactions. And almost all of them will happen in their first 20 to 30 minutes. So if you do have serious allergies, it's really important to tell people. And what we do is we just keep you at the site longer so that if they do manifest, they're treatable. Next slide. Okay. Do we really know about the side effects of the vaccine? Well, if you could just hit on the next slide, please. Let me see if that graphic works. Yes. So as of a couple of days ago, remember, there were close to 1 billion doses of vaccine that have been provided worldwide, right? And I would argue there has never been a rollout in medicine that has had the kind of scrutiny that this vaccine has, right? You all remember, you know, in December, a couple of people fainted after vaccination. Happens all the time, right? They made the front page of newspapers. So, you know, now these aren't just Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, and Johnson & Johnson. There are other players globally. But, you know, every week that goes by, we have more and more data, more reassurance about what's going on. And really, we're not getting a signal that there's anything horrific. Next slide, please. Okay, so now what about AstraZeneca? The one thing that has come up is this issue of blood clots. Next slide. So what do we know about the AstraZeneca vaccine? Well, remember that large study I mentioned in the US? They weren't able to demonstrate any increased incidence of blood clots. But remember, if something is very rare, you might not see it. It was 30 to 40,000 people in these studies. If the risk is much lower, it's not going to show up in these large studies. I think one of the successes of the surveillance program that's happened over the last couple of months is the recognition of this very rare type of clot that was identified in Europe. The best number I could find over the last couple of years is about 220 cases that have been identified in 34 million doses that have been given. So these are people who have taken the vaccine within the following 2 to 3 weeks. They have a very unusual type of blood clot in the brain. Now, this isn't the regular thrombus that we see quite commonly. People get in their legs, or sometimes they can end up in their lungs. It's a really unusual type of clot. We know that it's more common in women, and we're still trying to figure out if this is because it's indeed there's a gender issue here, or whether more women were actually getting the vaccine earlier. We know that women are overrepresented in the healthcare sector, but it does seem to be more common in young people. Now, the number that, if you do the math, 222 cases in 34 million people, it's about 1 in 100 to 1 in 200,000 people. I think that's the highest number that I'm seeing, which means it's quite rare. And I think certainly if we compare it to our chances of getting COVID, of getting very sick with COVID, of ending up in an ICU, where certainly COVID has been related to the formation of clots, the benefits certainly outweigh the risks, right, of getting this vaccine. So, again, this is something that's being looked at very closely. More information is coming. In Canada, of course, we made a decision initially to use this vaccine for people over 55. Actually, initially, we decided to use it for people under 65, then over 55. And you've heard, of course, in Ontario this week that that's been changed to people over 40. All right. Next slide, please. Okay, so finally, what's the plan for the vaccine rollout? Okay, if I'm committed to getting the vaccine, I know it's safe. I've learned about the side effects, realize I want to get it. It's kind of like the Wild West out there these days. Like if you remember, in early March, the province said they were going to roll out their web-based sign-up platform in mid-March, and I think a lot of hospitals said, look, we're not waiting. We set up our own websites. And so next slide, please. So you'll see if you go on to the provincial website, there's a number of different criteria for getting the vaccine. If you're over 60, you can get the vaccine everywhere. It's easy, right? If you're over 40, the AstraZeneca vaccine is available in pharmacies across Ontario, and it's also circulating now in primary care offices in a small way, but we expect that to expand. The government is also rolling out the vaccine at some sites for people with very high risk conditions. So these are generally people with malignancies, people on chemotherapy. You also heard a couple of weeks ago about the announcement of the vaccine rollout in hotspots. So these are places with very high rates of COVID. What's happened is that a lot of the community sites, instead of using 60 as their threshold, if you're coming from, if you live or work in a hotspot, it'll be 50. All right, so that age criteria is lower. And then we're seeing, and you've probably seen some of these pictures in the news of these mobile pop-up clinics, right? Some with just tents in apartment complexes. They're vaccinating anyone over 18 years of age, right? That live in these high prevalence areas. Very early in phase 1 of the rollout, we're in phase 2 right now. Congregate settings were identified as being high risk. So these are the long-term care homes we talked about, some shelters. Healthcare workers were also in phase 1. Many healthcare workers have already been vaccinated at provincial sites and in the community clinics. Faith leaders now are on the list. Adults in First Nation, Métis, and Inuit communities got their shots in phase 1, and they're still getting their shots now. Those that are receiving home care, elderly that are receiving home care, also on that list. And this changes really week to week, right? So this list, which is not fully complete, is really the list as of April 22nd. It very well could be different tomorrow. Next slide. Okay, the other thing I want to emphasize is that the COVID vaccines are all free. okay? And you don't need an OHIP card, right? So if you're a resident in Ontario, you should have access to the vaccine. Now, saying that, it has been really problematic that we cannot get people without an OHIP card to book an appointment on the provincial website. We flagged this for the government. We're told that it's really difficult to change the website. But for those of you that work with refugee claimants or people who are non-status, this has been a real challenge. We know in Toronto, where I work, that our local public health unit is looking at it and looking at some workarounds, but we really are hoping that this will change, that the provincial website will be able to accommodate people without OHIP. What is interesting is the hospital clinics in Toronto, at least, have no problems booking appointments for people without OHIP. It's not a mandatory screen there. So, all right, so next slide. Hopefully that gives you a really brief overview and allows you to formulate a bunch of questions, and I'm going to pass it on to my colleague and celebrity person here, Isaac Bogosh, who you all know from all the fantastic information he's been sharing with all of us on in the media. So thank you.
Hey everyone, Isaac here. Thanks, Dr. Rashid, or Meb, as I call him. That's fantastic and thorough. I truly don't have anything to add. I think maybe our time is best spent on Q&A, and I'm happy to participate on that side of things. But I think Meb gave a wonderful overview of the vaccine program, eligibility, how things are rolling out, pros and cons, not so many cons, mostly pros of each type of the vaccine and going to the science of the vaccine. Meb, do you think it's all right if we move to the Q&A at this point? Got the thumbs up. Okay, happy to take any questions at all. Do you want me to just go into the box?
Yeah, there's some questions in the.
Yes.
Do you want to handle that?
I will be reading the questions in the.
Oh, thanks, Alexandra.
Just to assist you guys. Okay, so the first question we have from Lillian Kondo. There was mention about the trial having diverse participants across race, sex, and age. Can you speak to those with other conditions and disabilities? Were some of these included in these populations as well? I guess she's meaning, were those populations taken into consideration when the trial was run?
Yeah, I can answer that. So the answer is yes and no. So oftentimes they don't actually explicitly state about various disabilities in terms of who is entered into clinical trials, but oftentimes certain people are excluded from clinical trials. So for example, pregnant individuals were excluded from these clinical trials. So we actually don't have as much data. We have data, but not as much data from pregnant individuals. We don't know about the many of the comorbidities of the underlying medical conditions of people in those clinical trials. Having said that, it's usually identical in the people that got the vaccine versus people that got the placebo. They randomized to each group, but it's not entirely clear what other disabilities that people have. The conditions are usually like high blood pressure, diabetes, like those other medical conditions.
Thank you very much. We'll move us to our next question from Roya from CCI. Is the AstraZeneca vaccine safe for females under the age of 40?
Good question. So we know that the AstraZeneca vaccine is associated, as Dr. Rashid pointed out, with a very rare, but of course not 0% risk of blood clots. Now, have you noticed how I'm using my medical legal language given the audience? We were very nervous about this. We heard lawyers. So yeah, we know that there is a risk of blood clotting events. It's not actually clear as to the extent or to what the true incidence of this is. In the Norwegian data, it could be about 1 in 25,000. In other data, it's 1 in 250 to 500,000. It's not entirely clear. What is clear is that it's still rare, and in general, it's predominantly but not exclusively in women. It's predominantly but not exclusively on the younger end of the spectrum. That's basically what we know. They set a cutoff of 40. I think that's very reasonable, even though many people under the age of 40 got it. Very few people had issues. Even though people over the age of 40 get it, very few have issues. It can still happen. You got to be careful. I think we have to treat an emergency like an emergency, right? We've never had this much COVID-19 in the country than ever before. Here's a vaccine that can literally save your life and protect those around you. I think the process of informed consent is extremely important, and people should be able to decide for themselves whether or not they want to take this vaccine or not, based on the risk. Obviously, during a time like this, when we have so much COVID-19 around, is very different from a time where, for example, we'd have very, very little COVID-19 and the risk is very low. So I think it's pretty reasonable that NACI said 40 plus for this rather than 55 plus. I think it'll help. That doesn't answer the question. Is it safe in those under the age of 40?
Yeah, that's what I was
I
gonna
mean, it depends on what your definition of safe is. Like, your risk of clotting is still there. It's just extremely low, but it's not 0%. It's probably a little bit higher than people on the older end of the spectrum, but probably not much higher.
Okay, thank you very much. Roya, I trust that answers your question. Next question. How long does the immunity last from all 4 vaccines?
Yeah, it's not entirely clear how long immunity lasts. It's, so we know that for most of these vaccines, they last for at least 6 months. It's probably longer, but it's at least 6 months. And there's data from these big clinical trials that moved to 6 months, and it showed that, for example, Pfizer and Moderna have like 90% efficacy at that point in time. It's pretty impressive. Well, it's probably going to be good for longer than that, 9, 12 months, who knows? But I think it's fair to say that regardless, we'll all probably need a booster shot. We'll all probably need to get a booster at some point in 2022. Now, is it going to be something that we need to get every single year? Unclear. But I think we'll probably need a booster to account for some of the circulating variants of concern that we see around the world.
Thank you. Okay, next question. Oh, this is an interesting one. So if the OHIP card is not necessary, can a visitor from overseas get it as well?
I don't know the full answer to that, but my answer is probably. I mean, I don't know. I would imagine. The problem is we're not getting a lot of visitors from overseas, right? Yeah. You have to have a good reason to be here. So I don't think this comes up too often.
Yes, I can venture a little bit into that. It's that if you do have to prove that you're a resident, it would be tough for a visitor to prove that they're a resident.
That's a good point. That's a very good point. Yeah, you still have to show some form of ID.
Exactly. So I think it will not, I don't think it will be much of an issue, as you said.
We actually don't have visitors.
Yeah. Okay, the next one from Mohammed. How likely is it that people who get vaccinated could get COVID?
Oh, it happens. It absolutely can happen. It's happened in the clinical trial. So 2 points. One is, remember, we're getting a first dose. We're not getting our second dose for up to 4 months. It might be shorter, but it's up to 4 months. I got to tell you, like, if you've had a first dose, you have some protection, but you don't have as much protection as if you've had 2 doses. I'm in the hospital right now. Like, we've seen people admitted to hospital 2 weeks after their first dose. Like, it can happen. Totally can happen. And quite frankly, we know from the clinical trials that people can still get this infection even after their second dose. The vaccine's really, really, really good, but it's not perfect. And people certainly can get vaccinated. Your risk just goes down dramatically. Like, your probability of getting COVID goes down probably over 90% compared to if you don't have a vaccine. So they're excellent, but they're not perfect. The other important thing is, it's one thing about getting COVID. It's another, if you've been vaccinated, it's another thing about getting sick and dying from COVID if you've been vaccinated. So for starters, the vaccines significantly reduce your risk of getting the infection. And of course, if you're unlucky enough to get the infection, they significantly reduce the likelihood that you're going to get really, really sick and die from this infection. Both pretty important metrics. The third thing is they probably actually help protect those around you from getting the infection as well. You're probably less likely to transmit to others.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question. I work in Ottawa with newcomers to Ottawa, and I have a problem to get my clients appointments for the vaccine, calling regional public health. They are placed on a special list, and it's taking a long time to call them to get the vaccine. We need to advocate for them, and with whom?
I don't know the answer to that. Honestly, these are very local questions, and I sort of function more at a provincial level, so I apologize. I just
that's okay. I was going to mention that maybe people from the local regions can get help from their MP for that. And so I won't burden you with the rest of that question. The next question, why is the second dose of vaccine taking so long in Canada while it takes less than a month in other countries?
Yeah, it's because we don't have enough vaccines. And because we don't have enough vaccines, we're doing a first dose fast approach. And it works. I mean, the UK did the exact same thing. They decided they're going to extend the duration of time between dose 1 and dose 2 by about 3 months. And they were able to vaccinate significantly faster and protect their population significantly faster. You watch that curve in the UK, went like that. The United States and Israel are basically the only two countries, I think, that have done the 2-dose regimen so close together and have stuck to the 21 and 28 day time frame between the first 2 doses. I'm pretty sure those are the only two countries. Maybe Serbia, maybe Chile. On the other hand, too, let's put Serbia and Chile into context. Again, kudos, credit where credit's due, but they're using vaccines that we don't have access to in Canada. We're not using like the Chinese or the Russian vaccines. So, I mean, I'm not knocking those vaccines. I'm just saying, let's just keep our criticism honest. The only countries that have used the vaccines that we are using, which are Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, and soon to be Johnson & Johnson, that have done the 2-dose vaccine series quickly are Israel and the United States. And if you look at all the G20 countries, like, let's just, again, fair comparison. Everyone keeps complaining in Canada. And, you know, of course, we got to be honest, like, it's slow and everyone's impatient. But if you look at the rate of vaccination in G20 countries, that's something reasonable to compare. Canada is actually the second fastest over the last week in terms of people being vaccinated, only behind the United States. If we look at our rates of vaccination in Ontario, yesterday, Ontario administered 134,000 vaccines in a day. The day before, it was about 136,000 vaccines in a day. That per capita is just about as fast as the United States is vaccinating right now, about 0.9-ish% of the population per day. So, like, there are very valid criticisms of the vaccine rollout, and I'll be the first to chat about them. I'm happy to chat about them. But, like, there's also some reasons to be happy. And in recent days and actually recent weeks, the pace of vaccine has certainly picked up. And we're actually vaccinating at a pretty significant pace right now.
Perfect, thank you. Next question. Are there any recommendations for immunosuppressed people as to which vaccine is safer?
No. For immunosuppressed?
Mm-hmm.
No, I don't. Meb, do you have any thoughts on this one?
No, I think all of them would be fine.
Yeah, same. Like, none of them are live vaccines. Like, you're not going to get an infection from the vaccine themselves. They all really promote a very robust immune response. I think they're all pretty good.
Perfect. Next question. What if a reaction appears the next day or the day after? What are the next steps for that person?
Oh, it's a great question. As Dr. Rashid pointed out, you know, some people do get a reaction to the vaccine. In fact, it's not uncommon. In fact, it's another way of saying that is it's common. People get, you know, headaches. They might have fatigue. They might have some muscle aches and pains. Sometimes even people get a fever. That certainly can happen. Usually it's mild. Usually it resolves on its own. Usually, like, the vast majority of the time, you just lie on the couch, take an acetaminophen, wash it down with some delicious water, have a nap, and you'll feel better in a few hours. That's usually the case. Obviously, if there's something significant, come in. Even though you're here, your healthcare system stretched beyond capacity, our doors never close. We're always happy to see you. But the vast majority of these last less than a day and are mild and go away.
Okay, next question. What is the effectiveness after the first shot, and how does the number of weeks between the first and second shot impact effectiveness?
I really like this question. So it's probably about 80-ish% after the first shot and higher in the 90s% after the second shot. Remember, you're only afforded protection 2 weeks after the shot. It takes some time for you to build up immunity after the shot. The weeks between it's not like you're going to lose power between shot 1 and shot 2. In fact, it's interesting. You know, anyone know why they chose 21 and 28 days between shots? Anyone? Anyone? This could be the interactive component that we pretend to have, even though it's a Zoom call that we can't actually have. It's so they can conduct the trial faster. It's so they can get the results out faster. There's nothing magical about 21 or 28 days. It's because they were really in a rush and you needed to have results. Can you imagine if they said we're going to wait 4 months to do this? We would only be getting our data from the clinical trials out like now, and then we'd be so far behind. So they actually compress those as tight as they can. When you look at any other shot, like for infections that are multi-dose vaccines, they're kind of spaced about, you can space them out pretty far. So like let me be clear, for the vast majority of people, spacing out these doses is probably just fine. It probably is. There, of course, are some people where I don't think we should be doing it. Those are people who are immunocompromised with organ transplants, with various types of cancer. I personally think at the extremes of age, like 80 plus is just a line in the sand that we could draw, but we could argue older or younger. I think that maybe we should shorten the duration, but for those, but for otherwise healthy young individuals, a 2-month delay, a 3-month delay is probably fine. And even a 4-month delay is probably just fine as well.
Perfect. And so I'm just being mindful of time and the amount of questions we have left.
Yeah, I have to hand over the torch to Meb. As you can tell, I'm on the hospital wards right now, so I actually have to run in a couple of minutes. But I don't need to leave Dr. Rashid high and dry with all these questions. But I'll take as many as I can in the next couple of minutes, and then I'll leave them high and dry. Sorry, Meb.
I think I'll give you the next.
No problem.
We can give the next ones, the next 4 to Dr. Rashid. And so the next one is, do Advil or similar over-the-counter medicine diminish the combative function of the individual's body to build antibodies shortly after receiving both shots?
Can I do that one and then hand over to Meb?
Yeah.
Okay, and then I'm going to log out. So this is really interesting. This is really, really interesting. There actually is some data suggesting that if you take acetaminophen or Advil, it may, keyword may, blunt the immune response to a vaccine. It's really neat. Listen, I can't look you in the eye and tell you it will, and if so, how much. But there are some arrows in the direction that it may blunt the side effect, you're mounting an immune response to a vaccine. So what do we do with that information? Maybe nothing. Maybe it means before you get the vaccine, don't pre-treat yourself with like an Advil or a Tylenol. But like after a vaccine, listen, if you have symptoms after a vaccine, like a fever, muscle aches and pains or anything like that, take it. Like don't suffer. But I thought that was kind of interesting. All right. May I politely tiptoe away to the hospital wards?
Thank you very, very much for your answers. They've been very helpful, and we wish you a great rest of your day.
Thanks, you as well. Lovely to chat, everyone. And I'll leave you in the good hands of Dr. Rashid. Take care, Meb.
Thanks, Isaac. Nice to see you.
Dr. Rashid, I have some questions for you. Some more.
Good. So I got the answer.
Okay, next question. Are there some concerns for long-term side effect?
The way I answer this question, it's an excellent question, is that with most vaccines, I would say all vaccines, the side effects we see with vaccines are generally within hours or days, rarely within weeks, but almost unheard of to have any reaction after 2 months, right? So it really is quite atypical. Anything is possible, but what I always remind people about is that, we're balancing that against the concerns for long-term side effects from COVID infection. And more there's a growing body of knowledge that's looking at, long COVID, or these long haulers will have symptoms months and months later. So at this point, I would be very surprised if with any of these vaccines, we see any long-term side effects. And certainly after 5 months, we're not seeing that yet.
Perfect. And so on to our next question. Have there been any studies or new information related to the vaccine and reducing the symptoms long haulers experience?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So there's been some literature out there. It's not fantastic literature where people who have these long COVID symptoms get a vaccine and their symptoms melt away. A lot of this has been anecdotal. I think it is being studied, but we don't have definitive word on that as yet.
Okay. And so I'll take 2 more questions here. Next one, what are the guidelines for someone with severe allergies, food and or environmental?
Get the vaccine. Okay, and I say that because remember, in the vaccine, there's no food products, there's no antibiotics. So some of those things that commonly cause allergies are not a problem with this vaccine. The other thing, again, is that if you're going to get a reaction, any serious reaction will happen in that first 30 minutes where you're going to be monitored and treatments are available. So, this might be more detailed than you want to get into. The thing that's considered to be most allergenic in both the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine is a constituent that's called polyethylene glycol, okay, what we call PEG, polyethylene glycol. We use it as a laxative. We use it as a preparation of the bowel before colonoscopy, but in small amounts. It's in a lot of over-the-counter medications, some cosmetics. My 25 years, I've never run into anyone who has a known allergy to it, but we think that will be one of the triggers if people get an allergic reaction. It is exceedingly rare to have a severe allergic reaction. So what we're telling people is if you're known to have a severe allergic reaction to anything, let us know, and then we'll keep you for 30 minutes, right, just to monitor you. Otherwise, without an allergic, that kind of history, you can often leave within 15 minutes after you get the vaccine. So should not prevent you from getting the vaccine, even if you're someone who has a lot of allergies.
Sounds great. And now for our last question. And so I know it's very rare, but for the blood clot side effects with the AstraZeneca vaccine, what would be the symptoms that should be flags that you should be following up?
It's an excellent question. So if you get the AstraZeneca vaccine and really you're looking at about 2 to 3, within the next 2 to 3 weeks, severe headaches, anything neurological, so change in vision, numbness, weakness on one side, and occasionally these clots have been noticed in the vasculature of the abdomen, so any severe abdominal pain. Look, even without the AstraZeneca vaccine, if you have any of those symptoms, you should be checking in with the doctor. So, those that have had it from the case series that we've seen, they have quite profound symptoms. And, important thing is just to be in touch with your family doctor or go to the emergency room as soon as you can. And it presents in a profound way. This is not something that's subtle.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you everyone for the questions. These were some great questions, actually very impressed by the questions being asked. On behalf of Connecting Ottawa, I would like to thank Dr. Rashid and Dr. Bogosh for the presentation today. We would love to thank you for the work you're doing on the front lines, especially your work with vulnerable communities in Ontario. And so just thank you very much for your service and the sacrifice of your time. We're asking our participants to please review the resource sheet that's available. We've put numerous organizations on that sheet, and those organizations are able to provide in plain language, multilingual resources that you can refer your clients to if they have health questions related to the vaccine. So thank you very much, Dr. Rashid. Thank you, Dr. Bola.
Thank you.
Already gone. And we're really, really thankful for the wealth of information you've provided today.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. Bye, everyone.
Bye. All right.